les capacités requises
for all governments. The African Union recognizes cybersecurity.
Pour tous les gouvernements. Donc, l'Union africaine reconnaît.
I think we have an issue with the interpretation.
Nous sommes là, we are here. Can you hear us?
Well, we can hear you, but I think the interpreters, the channels, I think they have to be, you are coming the same time as I speak. So let me continue. The African Union Commission recognizes cybersecurity and data protection as integral and indivisible part of technological and digital revolution. These safeguards are essential to creating the trusted environment necessary for e-commerce, e-government, and digital services generally to take off. Digital inclusion with the necessary protection for citizens will be an essential lever in post-COVID-19 economic reconstruction across the continent and a determinant of the degree to which countries will be able to benefit from the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The complex global geopolitical situation and the lack of global consensus on cyberspace make it even harder for developing nations to promote coherent confidence building measures agenda. Our speaker this afternoon will attempt to walk us through the challenges, highlight key mitigation measures, and provide some answers. Join me to welcome Mr. Abdelhakim Ajujola, the chair of the African Union Cybersecurity Expert Group, among others, Dr. Alison Gilward, the executive director of Research ICT Africa, Mr. Mokhtar Yadali, head of Information Society Division, African Union Commission, Dr. Nena Ajofo, lecturer and vice chair of the African Union Cybersecurity Expert Group, Mr. Vladimir Randovich, Cybersecurity and Diplomacy Program Director, Diplo Foundation. Okay, so as we said, we are going to start with questions to our panelists. We have a very distinguished group of panelists. I think most of you know our panelists. I start my first question to Mr. Mokhtar Yadali, the head of Information Society within the African Union Commission. I think it's very important to know what is the role of the African Union Commission in terms of building trust in the cyber space, particularly for policymakers in AU member state, to enable them to confidently engage. And in the same context, I would like him to explain what are the initiatives that are currently being considered by the African Union Commission and how they are all going to help close this trust gap in Africa. Mr. Yadali.
Thank you very much, Adel, and hello, everybody. It's also very good to have you here. It's good for me also. I'm very happy to be here with so much prominent speakers like Alison, Vladimir, Abdul Hakim, and Nena. And allow me also to congratulate you and your team for organizing these events within the framework of the Internet Governance Forum. The question you have asked me is related to the role or what has been done by the African Union Commission so far. And before answering straight to that question, I would like just to mention something very important to me, which is actually that the digital transformation is a requirement for survival for the African continent, and it is also a geopolitical challenge for the continent. The economy and the threat of the future are the race for data collection, and Africa must do something in order to avoid digital colonization. With the exponential growth of digital technology globally, African state must reap the maximum benefit while trying to remain sovereign. It's very important. This digital sovereignty is extremely important. Having said that, the African Union Commission, on behalf of the member states' objectives overall, is to have each and every member of the Union adopting a cyber strategy, number one. Number two, to have them adopting, each of them, a cyber legislation, modern and adaptable to the context. And lastly, each of them should have established a computer emergency incident response team, CERT. So 10 years ago, the African leadership have seen the importance of cybersecurity, and my team and I have been requested to draft a normative text on the cybersecurity, and we went beyond the expectation of the head of state, and we drafted the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity, Personal Data Protection, and Electronic Transaction. So 10 years ago, in 2010, we really seen the importance of protecting our electronic transactions, and the fact that the link between the cybersecurity and the personal data protection. And that's how we have been working since 2010 to have the Malabo Convention adopted in 2014. Right after the adoption of this convention, we start negotiating with the European Union the PRIDA project, which is the policy for regulatory initiatives for digital Africa. And the project's aims, really, one of the major things the project's aiming at is to build the capacity on internet governance and digital governance. And this is how we've been able to build most of the capacity within the African continents and among diplomats, to allow them to make the African Union and the African member state voice heard in the global context. Now, this is what we have done so far with related to cybersecurity. And allow me to insist on the fact that it is very important for us as African to finally start really using the digital technologies to change the way we are conceiving our development. This is why in 2020, the African Union adopted the digital transformation strategy, of which the major pillar actually is cybersecurity. With that, I hand it over to you, and thank you for your kind attention.
Just a small follow-up question, Mokhtar. Can you tell us the current status of the digital transformation strategy? I understand it has been adopted early this year by the head of state and government, but what is the next steps?
After the adoption in January last year, unfortunately, we just hit right away the COVID-19. And while our priority was really to start building a framework for the implementation involving the regional economic community, the specialized institutions, the member states, we started doing that in March, and then COVID-19 comes in, and we reorient our activities now in implementing specifically the component of the digital transformation related to one, the e-education and e-health specifically, in addition to the activating the working group on artificial intelligence that will start tomorrow, actually really being operational. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mokhtar. So we heard what the African Union Commission is doing in terms of building confidence. Alison, Dr. Alison, the next question to you. As stated by Mokhtar, Africa cannot afford waiting on the sidelines until the trust issue is eventually sorted out by others, and in the process miss the train of the fourth industrial revolution. So given the complexity and constraint that the African they're facing in terms of participation in this digital revolution, what is it in practical terms? What is it that that can be advised by you through the research that you have done through the years to address this issue from a policy and governance perspective? Hello, Alison, can you hear me?
My apologies, having turned my mute off, I seem to have turned it back on. Thank you very much, Adele, for your question, and looking forward very much to engaging on this really important topic with these eminent panelists, because the issue of trust is absolutely central to redressing issues of digital inequality, of creating the kind of digitally enabled environment that we need to redress the problems that we faced with COVID-19, that we'll need to address if we're going to get the kind of economic reconstruction that we're wanting with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. all of these are underpinned by trust. And I just wanted to sort of take a step back quickly and just say, you know, the issue of trust is a big issue in the analog world. It's a big issue offline. A lot of the literature, the political economy, the political science literature at the moment is around the lack of trust of institutions, the lack of trust of governments, you know, the challenges that we have from things, normative frameworks that we've had, you know, trusted and used for years and years. So there's, you know, the enormous complexities around issues of trust. It's not just a tap you switch on or off. It's really got to be earned, and we've got to contribute to making those work. So how, you know, how can we? I wanted to just start with distinguishing trust from security and from safety. So these are underpinnings of trust, but you need them. They're kind of necessary conditions for trust, but you don't automatically get trust once you've just got a secure system. Obviously, you need a secure system, and in that sense, building very much on what Mokhtar said, the underpinnings of trust are having a safe and secure internet, cybersecurity, in that sense. And then the other one is, you know, the data protection that would actually protect people's rights online. And I think that's a very important thing because, you know, very often in many jurisdictions, we're looking for signatories, people to be commit to conventions, global conventions and regional conventions that are underpinned by a human rights framework that is sometimes not existing in our countries. So it's absolutely incredibly important that for the legal systems to work, we have to have rule of law, we have to have these institutions that work, then we need the cybersecurity overlay just to get the security, then we need the data protection. But the trust actually comes on how those systems are used. You know, cybersecurity can be abused for public surveillance and private surveillance. In fact, commercial surveillance is a big challenge for us with these global platforms and monopolies. So we've got to be careful that, you know, cybersecurity is trusted, it's transparent, it's accountable. And likewise with our data protection, you know, it's no use just taking very sophisticated data protection systems from very mature economies and mature democracies and trying to put them into a context where we don't have the institutional arrangements to enforce them, etc. On the other hand, we're part of a global system. We've got to align with those. We've got to be able to ensure that even the most marginal people coming online understand their rights and have the ability to, you know, and have the competencies and capabilities to check the system and to trust that it is working in their favor.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I think you made a very important point, is that even though security and safety is the big elephant in the room, but there are some other component of trust that needs to be earned in order for the ecosystem to work, to function properly. Abdul Hakim, a question to you, the next question to you. In the absence of globally binding legal framework on cyberspace, please explain the importance of international cyber norms for building confidence in the cyberspace. And I want you to zoom in one of the norms and explain to us why it is relevant to Africa and it's the impact on the African in terms of building their trust in ICT.
Got to unmute myself, sorry. Okay, first of all, let's put some of these norms in the global context. First of all, at the United Nations level, it has been agreed, broadly agreed that on a set of norms. And these norms basically are based on a principle that international law applies in cyberspace. So none of these things are considered beyond that context of international law. So international law does apply in cyberspace. Now, having said that, the UN has so far articulated a set of 11 norms, which basically are aimed at setting some clear expectations of what is responsible cyber behavior, especially by state actors during peacetime. Now, of course, sometimes during wartime, you know, some bets are off, if not all bets. But the point is that these norms and confidence building measures are to try and prevent us from getting to a wartime situation. And then these 11 norms, which I'll get into in a moment, are underpinned or driven or supported by certain confidence building measures. And indeed, some of the norms themselves are inherently confidence building measures, and I'll get into that in a moment. But the other key component of, its underlying cyberspace is based on international law. These norms is actually the issue of capacity building. Without capacity building at various levels, whether it's systems, whether it's people, whether it's governance structures, all of these things. And the idea is to harness the benefits on the one side, but ensure that we mitigate the risks on the other side of our interconnectivity. And I'd like to just draw on something that Mr. Mokhtar had said earlier. And the key word that he used, really, this is about survival. And I think Africa very urgently needs to develop a cadre of cyber diplomats. I'm not talking about simply the African Union, but African nations as a whole. And so that we can make sure that the African priorities and perspectives are properly reflected, as a foundation to those new types of international relationships that are emerging. I am pleased to note that the African Union, in fact, in recent weeks, has actually done some interventions on this specific issue. But the challenge is actually beyond the African Union. The African nation states themselves must begin to see that cyber diplomacy is a new area that is in their national self-interest. So let's go over very quickly what are the 11 norms. Number one is really about interstate cooperation. 2 is about considering relevant information. 3 is one that I think is of particular interest, that is prevent the misuse of ICTs in each of our jurisdictions. Because many of us erroneously believe that cyberspace is borderless. And that is because it appears or simulates borderlessness to the end user and also to the bad actor. However, we must appreciate that cyberspace for the law enforcement and for the nation state is restricted by those activities and especially systems that are within its jurisdiction. So an investigator, for example, in Morocco cannot simply go to a server in Zimbabwe and interrogate it, or even a Zimbabwean citizen who's physically in Zimbabwe. You need that kind of cooperation so that African states, and again, underpinned by the African Union, can do this. Number 4 is actually a call to ensure that there's some level of cooperation and stopping of crime and terrorism. Number 5 is respect for human rights. I think this is something that all nations, not just African nations, could do well to improve upon. Number 6 is not to damage critical infrastructure. So for example, if you have an undersea fiber cable and it passes in front of your country, you shouldn't damage it because you're having a problem with the next country, because that undersea cable not only services the next country, but services several other countries, further down the line. Then you have a duty to protect critical infrastructure, to respond to requests from other nations for assistance. And then we have to find ways, and this is number 9, ensure this, the security of the supply chain or various supply chains. And then we talk about number 10, which is to report ICT vulnerabilities. And number 11, which again, Mokhtar had touched upon, do no harm to emergency response teams, the CSIRTs that he talked about. And the analogy of the CSIRTs is that they are like hospitals. So that in physical, nation-state interactions, you don't attack schools, you don't attack women, you don't attack children, you don't attack hospitals, because the hospitals basically, again, in this case, the CSIRTs are analogous in cyberspace to hospitals. They are the place where, things are rebuilt, the reconstruction, getting the system to be better, so that if it's infected by some kind of virus or malware, that's like a disease. The hospital develops the vaccines or develops the cures. The hospital does the medical research. But the idea is that you shouldn't use hospitals, in this case the CSIRTs, for developing offensive capabilities. And in return, other nations should respect that the hospitals, or in this case the CSIRTs, shouldn't be touched. And very quickly, and I'll talk about this a little later, but let me just touch on it. The confidence building measures, really, the intent here is to ensure that we achieve some level of predictability. It helps different nations seek and obtain clarification on what's going on, because usually that's where misunderstandings leading to conflicts happen. The CBMs also help in calming things down so that time is gained in order to do proper and in-depth introspection and reflection before an action is taken. CBMs also lead to improving of understandings and certainly help the system, and that's now the global system, including states and regional bodies, to reach some kind of enhanced maturity. And finally, there are basically three general overarching types of confidence building measures. We look at those that are information, interaction, and communication measures, where states talk to each other. The second type is actually the verification and observation, where some level of transparency is engaged by the various states so that others can see what they're doing, because sometimes seeing is believing. And then the third type of confidence building measures are in the bucket of what we'd call constraints, so that you just don't take precipitous action, you're not careless. So again, while states are encouraged to have in place, national legislation, remember, norms in of themselves are voluntary. And if we look at what has happened in laws of the sea, the laws of outer space, one I forget now, but nuclear proliferation, some of these norms took decades to evolve into international law, but they did evolve. So arguably, norms are soft laws, they are voluntary, but Africa needs to be part and parcel of their development and also their articulation, because eventually they are likely to evolve into hard international laws that we must obey whether we like it or not. And so this is why it is crucial, as I said before, that Africa participates in those conversations. Africa has its own set of cyber diplomats who understand what's going on, who are able to advise the national governments and take these processes forward in the best self-interest or national security interest of not just the African nations, but the African continents. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Abdul Hakim. I think two points got my attention. I think it's the norms in themselves, they are not enough. You need to do capacity building around the norms, and then the process of making sure that these norms are implemented is not necessarily a top-down. It can also work bottom-up in terms of member state, doing their job in terms of implementing those norms. The question to Vlada now. There is a lot of discussion about sovereignty, Vlada, and now this exponential growth of digital technology globally. How can the African states reap maximum benefit, bearing in mind of the issue of sovereignty, and taking a page from the lesson learned from other parts of the world? What more can be done to build the necessary trust in Africa?
Thank you, Adil. It's really a pleasure to be considered again an African. It's an honor for me, and a responsibility as well. And I'm always happy to be in such a good company. When I was thinking about that question initially, what came to my mind was a couple of opportunities and a couple of risks. And I'll start with opportunities, because I think what Alison mentioned, there are more elements to trust than just safety and security. And to my mind, turning technology into opportunities is also a good way to increase trust. And I'll start with opportunities. The first one is, Alison mentioned it, the data. And we know that as I think Mokhtar at the beginning also mentioned, as the Internet of Things is coming, the artificial intelligence, the virtual worlds and all of that, and with COVID, of course, as we are sort of under digitalization on steroids, data will be abundant, and we'll have a lot of data around which we have to somehow use, right, smartly. Now, Africa as such a big place on the earth with so many people will definitely be a producer, and is already, but it will be more and more of vast amounts of data. Certainly the newcomers in Africa which will connect will not start using the email. They'll start immediately from, I don't know, the Instagram or video games or whatever that would be around. So the first thing is to make sure that Africa does not export the data, its own data as a raw material in a way, something like what has been in the history of Africa with diamonds and other things, but rather turn it into a service, turn it into a process, export a process, see how to use the African data for particular applications that then you can export as a product to others. I think there is a lot of opportunity with that, with artificial intelligence, which will be learning on data, certainly about various industrial processes, traffic control, whatever you wish. There'll be a lot of opportunities to actually harness this data on the African soil and try to feed it into different applications that then as a package you can actually export. And that is something that I see as a first opportunity. And the second one is with all the emerging technologies that we mentioned, I think creativity will be increasingly needed. The technologies will most likely, because of the circumstances, still be sort of devised in other places, in the US, in Japan, China, in EU maybe. That's about it. They have various infrastructures in place, funding and everything else to develop new technologies, unfortunately, still. But the implementation of these technologies will be increasingly important. You have again, abundance of new technologies. How do you implement that? Creativity is something that'll be a key. And to be honest, I see no other region which is as creative as Africa. I mean, start with music, start with arts. One of those behind me, the Kenyan art. Start with even the technical services like M-Pesa, which was really a groundbreaking sort of an ancestor of the digital currencies that we're talking today. So Africa has a huge potential on this creative part of development, new applications and so on. And then the two risks. One is the cyber conflict and this misuse of cyberspace by governments in a way. And Abdul Hakim has mentioned much of that. When Secretary General of the UN, I think it was a year ago, mentioned that he's afraid that the new conflicts will actually start with cyber attacks, I didn't read it as a signal to the US-China relations or US-Russia relations. Those guys are quite cautious of what they're going to do because all-out war they know what it means. What I'm more concerned about is where the conflicts actually are today, and they're mainly in Africa and Middle East. Used to be in Balkans, luckily not that much these days. So I would start with thinking how cyber conflicts could actually escalate in war-torn regions where the countries not necessarily understand issues of attribution, of international law applicability, and how to manage that, and the conflicts could easily escalate because of cyber attacks. So that's one big concern. The other big concern, certainly we can't stop the armament, and the countries we notice, African countries, are also developing offensive capabilities to penetrate into other systems. I guess we can't reduce this global trend. What we can do, we can make sure that we reduce the vulnerability of cyberspace, that the gadgets that we connect are less vulnerable and no one can exploit them, including governments. And I can reflect furthermore on one interesting project, Geneva Dialogue, that I would like to see Africans more involved. And the other one is exactly what we've heard from Abdul Hakim is the development of norms, of confidence building measures. And for instance, Africa doesn't have any of the confidence building measures, unlike ASEAN, the OSCE in Europe, even the Organization of American States. They have some sort of CBMs being developed. The least that Africa could do, until it maybe develops its own CBMs or takes some of the existing ones, would be, for instance, to, as African states, endorse the GG recommendations, including norms and CBMs that Abdul Hakim mentioned. The Asian states did it on a ministerial level. Now, this doesn't change the rules of the game. They might still be voluntary, but once the states endorse it, it's a different level. That could be an easy way to go. And to conclude, as a bottom line, certainly the other risk is standards, and we are going to see more of the conflicts on top of AI standards, 5G standards, Internet of Things security standards, even IP protocols and the protocols, and there will be a global technological war that I don't think any one of us will be able to skip, Africa included, but you can do the best to be out of it to the largest possible extent. So the bottom line is, engage more with diverse policy processes around the world. Things are changing. Define the rules of the games. I think that's really something that needs to be done. And I'm glad to hear also from Mokhtar things are moving in Africa. Prioritize issues. Abdul Hakim mentioned cyber diplomacy. I think developing foreign affairs strategies on a national levels, even on a African Union levels, but also national levels, understanding what are the priority topics for foreign affairs, for diplomatic service is a key. And finally, capacity building that needs to be done simultaneously. And PRIDA is a good example for that. And I'll stop there. Adil, back to you.
Thank you very much, Vlada. I guess the cyber diplomats is an emerging theme from the speakers, and I think this is something that the African Union would look into and see, try to help the country how to implement a program advocating for cyber diplomats on the continent. The next question goes to Nena. Dr. Nena, could the ratification of Malabo Convention be the answer for a united continent with shared norms, standard and principle, providing a common voice and a base for trust building across the continent? Mokhtar made the mention of the Malabo Convention. So could you please tell us if that is, if the convention could be the answer for a united continent?
Adil, and thank you very much for this opportunity to engage with colleagues who are very much interested in the advancement of a trusted digital space in Africa. Based on a question, indeed, in this age of cyber uncertainties, the ratification of the Malabo Convention is a huge and major step towards an African regional consistency, if you like, in terms of cybersecurity and data protection. As Mr. Mokhtar rightly pointed out, the Malabo Convention is a fundamentally important regional legislation, which, if you like, broadly covers data protection, cybersecurity, and cybercrime, as well as ensuring a trusted place for electronic transactions. So it encourages the policing of cyberspace and the protection of data through a unified regional regulatory framework. But unfortunately, we in Africa...
La protection des données va nous aider par rapport à la protection des données.
Interpreters, I think you are getting into the live. Continue.
So, but unfortunately, we in Africa have seemingly failed to appreciate the value of protecting critical infrastructure, protecting cyberspace.
Donc en Afrique, malheureusement, nous n'avons pas forcément.
And we have also failed to appreciate digital rights. So as the case is in Africa now, most African states today have little or no data protection regulation or even cybersecurity legislation. So sometimes it seems like it's hardly a priority. And where there exists some form of data protection regulation, there is so much disparity in implementation with no unified regional approach. Now, the significance of the Malabo Convention depends to a large extent on its adoption.
Et donc tout ceci dépend bien sûr de l'adoption.
Depends to a large extent on its adoption by African states, and that is why we need a unified, a united and common voice with shared norms, standards and principles. Africa must create its own cybersecurity and data protection agenda. We must develop an African position. And so for that, we need a clear legal framework on cybersecurity and data protection. And so it is important that we pursue a unified approach. And this is the
Pour
importance.
cela, il faudrait
This is the significance of ratifying the Malabo Convention.
ratifier la Convention de Malabo.
If we must project a corporate or
Donc, si
if we must project cooperation in the sphere of
nous
cyber,
devons parler de cette coopération,
now, in as much as we promote digital sovereignty, which Valde has talked about, digital cooperation remains fundamental in this age. I was very happy when Mr. Abdul Hakim was talking about the fact that we need mutual legal cooperation in Africa. So these several sub-regional regulations, the various national cybersecurity laws and regulations may not continue to suffice. I say this because cyberspace is not tied to any geographically proximate location. So it is impossible for African states to individually ensure cybersecurity without cooperation. So it is important that we really look forward and look to how we must ensure cooperation in terms of ratifying the Malabo Convention. Now, the development of compatible and harmonized cybersecurity laws will be very important in terms of how we progress with the Malabo Convention so that it will benefit commerce, trade, development, and the economy in Africa, especially in a time when we in Africa have decided to establish a single continental market. Again, we must build a culture of safety and security for cyber activities and data protection. And I always say that charity begins at home. It doesn't begin with international conventions, which we would rather prefer to ratify. It must commence with ratifying that which is our own. So finally, cybersecurity and data protection are and will always remain an integral and indivisible part of this digital revolution. We need to earnestly work towards building a trusted African digital space, which is necessary for our social, for our economic, and for our political development as well. And it should commence from the ratification of the Malabo Convention. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nina. I think just a follow-up question to you, maybe, or Mokhtar. What is the status now of the ratifications and how far we need to go until the convention becomes a law?
If the question addressed to me, and I will tell you that so far, we are at 10 ratification out of 15.
So we have 5
and
to go. Yeah?
We have 5 to go, and the African Union cybersecurity expert group has put in front of himself the challenge to have the ratification happen by 2020. That was a dream before COVID-19. Now the COVID-19 has changed everything, and unfortunately will not be able to meet that target. But again, we are too close, and we hope that will be early next year, be able to have that 15 ratifications to have this convention entering into force. Over to you.
Yeah, I also want to take this opportunity to call out our audience to encourage their countries to ratify the Malabo Convention. I think it's important, as Dr. Nena mentioned, to have harmonized legal framework on the continent so that we can start, the real digital transformation in Africa, including the e-trade, cross-border collaboration. Thank you very much. And I think I know that people are very eager to ask questions. I think keep asking questions on the comment line. I think we are very close to start the questions from filtering questions from the comment line. But I think we have just a couple of questions remaining for all panelists before we open the Q&A session. Back to you, Mokhtar. COVID-19 has been a significant crisis that impacted the whole world. But in Africa, I think digital currencies proved to be a lifeline during this pandemic. What kind of structure should the African state put in place, including policies and strategy for continuity in a trusted digital currency environment?
Thank you, Adil, very much for this question. let me just remind everybody that what so-called mobile banking now and has started in Africa. But also you have to note one thing, that it started in Africa, not by Africans. And then it's become a African trademark, and now everybody is using the mobile banking and mobile transactions outside of the continent. And probably this is a good thing that now actually something is being exported out of Africa. Knowledge, capacity is being exported out of Africa, not like, just raw material like Vladimir has said, and other things, and data probably. Now, having said that, the mobile banking and the digital currencies could be the option for financial inclusion for most of our citizens. However, this required really, in the context of our discussion, trust. The needed infrastructure, soft and hard, need to be put in place in order to have the African continent enjoying those applications surrounding the financial transaction in general. Unfortunately, two things have not happened. There is no yet a bottom-up approaches for that, which means member states have not yet expressed the interest to really have policy and or regulation adopted by at the continental level or at national level with regard to this matter. And there is no yet top-down approach from the African Union to really push for those kind of policy and regulatory frameworks that are necessary for starting using this. So we are facing a very critical, again, situation. There is no yet the infrastructure, nor the frameworks, but it is time for us to start thinking about it. Most of the people went from what we call the hard currencies to the plastic card, and then are evaluating for the digital currency. We need to jump that intermediary step, which is actually the plastic card, the credit card, and so on. And only very good leadership African leadership will help to really try put Africa on that. I know there is a tremendous amount of challenges. Part of our member states still haven't yet had that financial currency autonomy, and you maybe understand what I mean of. Some still use some currency that are being printed outside of the continent. Some countries don't even have minister of finance. But again, we need to break this wall in going through that kind of, how I can put it, to go straight away and really start pushing for not only an African currency, but also digital African currency. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mokhtar. Back to you, Alison. I think you touch upon this subject, which is the tension between rights and security. And I think, we have been witnessing now a lot of issues popping up from fake news, cyber terrorism, shutdowns, and yes, you name it. And I think, how can we, how can we get the right balance in this equation, in the context of all what is going on? Some countries now are extremely getting impatient, and then there is a concern that there's going to be fragmentation of the internet because of all this tension. So can you shed more light into this subject, please? You are muted, Alison.
Sorry, again. Adil, may I take this opportunity also to answer Maciel Marilia's excellent question in the chat? It relates to what I will be talking about.
I think we can do that after we finish.
Okay.
I don't know what the question, but if it's related, then maybe, yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, and it just followed on from what I said earlier about, you know, the ability of countries to leverage the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will be the degree to which they're digitally ready, and in the degree to which they have these trust frameworks, these security frameworks, these data protection frameworks in place. But I think the important point about the very excellent question is the interrelationships from a global governance perspective and the different multilateral negotiations that are going on. So one of the issues that I was making in the point I was making in the beginning, and I want to pick up on now, is that, you know, trust has several dimensions to it, but it has tended to be equated with cybersecurity on the one hand, and it's tended to be equated with the e-commerce debates on the other. And that was the early e-commerce debates where we were really talking about, you know, a small piece of the economy that was online, retailing online, business to business, government to business, a small part of the economy. What we're talking about now in terms of digital economy is the digitalization of the entire economy. The contemporary economy is digital. And that's why it's so important that it's not just about creating, you know, trusted online systems or untrusted retail systems or financial systems. All of these critical infrastructures, the trust and the security within them is now interdependent. And it goes back to the very important point that's been emphasized by a number of speakers on the need for a transversal policy that will deal with these different, you know, challenges and potentially the tensions that you raise between different rights. Now, I think these tensions can be managed if one has you know, rights-based, people-centered, transparent institutions and processes, policy processes, and implementation processes that are accountable, and, you know, people have recourse to the courts and law and those kinds of things. So I think they can be managed, but we do have somewhat of a tension in terms of individual and collective rights, at least probably, but I think also on individual and individual rights, between freedom of expression, which is effectively, you know, the counter side to privacy protections and which data protections, you know, right. So in building democracies, we want freedom of expression. The internet is, you know, the United Nations has said that this is the enabler of human rights, and freedom of expression is a critical aspect of that in building our democracies, strengthening our democracies, and I should add, building trust in our institutions. If our institutions are transparent, if people can, you know, if there's an open data regime that people can see data, use it to build businesses, etc. This is all about, you know, the openness that we would see. But there are tensions, you know, around, for example, you know, individual rights to privacy, which have become, you know, they've become amplified under COVID with people's concerns about their private information, their health information, needing to be protected for, you know, collective interests, for the collective
aux informations privées, les informations médicales, qui seraient en fin de compte utilisées pour le bien et l'essor collectif.
Translator, I think you're crossing lines.
Yes, go ahead.
So I just wanted to say, I mean, I think these are important things. We actually have rights frameworks that can manage these different things. That's very important. Obviously, there's certain things that we can do at the national level and the global level. And I think it's really important to understand data, the internet, cybersecurity as global public goods that need to be realized at the national level, that these global public goods, you know, I've said often before, the cybersecurity, international cybersecurity system is only as strong as the weakest link. And I think, you know, international governments, donor organizations, lots of people realize this, they put a lot of money into capacity building and that sort of thing. But African governments also need to realize that, you know, they have to take responsibility for the realization of those public goods at the national level. And, you know, various things, if you don't have in place, you will not realize them. Obviously, cybersecurity is one of them. Data protection is another. And as I said, you know, it's very important to have a data protection framework in place that is provides enough privacy for to prevent the harms that people face from international flows of information that we're seeing, that will allow them to access that information, but also to mitigate the risks that we know are, accompany these massive now data collection systems that are on our global platforms, on our monopoly platforms that, currently are more or less not accountable to anyone. So working at the national level, the establishment of information regulators, I think the establishment of an African coordinating information regulators entity is a very positive move, because in fact, the implementation of a lot of these data protection mechanisms, etc., can only be implemented through global cooperation, because they operate in a global system. So the collaboration at the continental level could really strengthen the regional response to this, and align and engage with international regulators who are equally new and struggling with this, for protection of data for elections, as we've currently seen, breaches of that and the manipulation of data. So strong data governance systems to prevent interference in elections, to enable e-commerce to flourish, but that really requires people, gaining trust in the system, based on the technical elements that you need in order to provide a safe and secure internet.
Hello?
The trust comes from the enforcement of rights.
I think we lost Alison. Hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry, Adil, I'm not quite sure where you lost me. I was just emphasizing
the last sentence. Your last sentence. I think we get the gist of it. So I think thank you very much. I know that people are waiting for the question to be answered.
Please les gens attendent anxieusement pour adresser les questions. Veuillez patienter un peu. Tentez de garder tout ceci. Nous avons une dernière question aux panélistes et ensuite je vais donner la parole aux membres du panel.
I think we have some interference from interpreters coming into the live feed. My final question to Dr. Nene, the COVID-19 pandemic, so many of the services went online, including e-education for our kids and teenagers that now they are online, and of course the risk of child exploitations and what kind of measure that we need to make sure that they're in place to make sure that our children are protected online.
I think we put it mildly in this in Africa when we talk about online safety for children. So basically, we'll just say sexual exploitation, radicalization, but then a lot more is going on in terms of child abuse, child trafficking online, child pornography, access to online pornography by children, illicit, indecent content, and even online gambling targeted at children. And essentially, Adil, your question actually highlights a point in terms of comprehensive policies and strategies to safeguard the interest of children. And I would approach this question from a three-way approach, looking at governments, digital companies, as well as responsible parenting, because if there was a hierarchy in parenting, I would accord that to responsible parenting in this age. And it takes me back to why I said we need a unified approach when I was talking about the Malabo Convention in ensuring a safe digital space in Africa. Unfortunately, what is criminalized in terms of online safety for children is different when you come to different jurisdictions in Africa. I will touch on child pornography, for example. You find that there is no unified standard for the conception of age when you talk about the age for child pornography. When you talk about what is criminalized in terms of child pornography, for example, there is no unified approach. In some jurisdictions, it may be possession. In some jurisdictions, it stops at distribution. And so we must come together and look for a unified approach first in solving this issue. And then we must put online safety for children on the agenda as a policy and strategic priority. permit me to say, that we are so focused on curbing financial electronic crimes in Africa that we neglect many other aspects of insecurity in cyberspace. So in as much as we've ratified so many child rights conventions, we must develop distinct policies specifically targeted at online safety for children at the regional level, sub-regional, and even national levels. And policies are not just to be left alone for governments. We should also have policies for schools, for internet service providers, for companies, and all that. And we must focus on implementation. We must focus on enforcement, because even if we have these strategies so that we tick the boxes, we must look at implementing them. And one of the ways of implementing strategies focused on online safety for children will be about reporting. We hardly have reporting mechanisms in Africa for child protection when you talk about child protection in the digital age. We also do not have statistics in Africa. We hardly know what is going on. This year in the UK, just as an example, there was a white paper on online harms, and the result was that since that paper has been released, you have over 25,000, in fact, above 26,000 offensive images about children online, and that every day you have about 90 cyber crimes targeted at children. Now you beg to imagine what will be happening in Africa. So we need to develop our own statistics as well, which will feed into the policy and the strategy perspectives of how we progress with ensuring online safety. Digital companies have to be responsible, and governments must take responsibility for ensuring that digital companies are responsible. We can hold ISP providers accountable as well in how we protect children online. If companies are held accountable, it will ensure a framework for tackling a comprehensive set of online harms. It could be for illegal activities, it could be for content behaviors and things that are harmful to children. Now, because of time, I'll quickly talk about responsible parenting. And parents must get involved in understanding what online safety means, ensuring parental controls. Schools must understand what online safety means as well. And maybe, think in terms of including cybersecurity education in their curriculums. I cannot emphasize it enough. Education, education, education. When we educate, we take a people-centered approach. If laws are there, they become stagnant if people are not even aware of the existence of these policies, of these laws. And so education must take on a multi-stakeholder approach. Parents should be aware, teachers should be aware, children should also be aware, including governments and companies, so that we can, as we progress, even after the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of education, in terms of policy, in terms of our cultural understandings and our cultural perspectives, we will work
progressé en matière de compréhension
towards ensuring that we safeguard the online space for our children.
On puisse s'assurer que l'on sauvegarde cet espace numérique pour nos enfants.
Ensure their safety as it is today.
En vulnérables, et donc c'est à nous de s'assurer qu'ils soient en sécurité et en sûreté.
Merci, Adil. Thank you, Adil.
Thank you very much. You were able to make it despite the interruptions. Now I hand the mic to my colleague.
Là, je vais donner
to fill
le micro à mon collègue pour adresser les questions.
Thank you very much, Adil, and good afternoon, everyone. I just want to insist that the interpreters would use the French channel, please, not to interfere with this session in English. So just a couple of things. We're trying to make this session as interactive as possible to update everyone. This is a webinar format, which means most of the attendees are not able to see the number of participants. So we have 33 attendees and 15 panelists, including our esteemed speakers and the technical teams working on this project. So we have a number of contributions from the attendees, and I would like to encourage everybody to use the Q&A window in order to ask their questions or provide their comments. I will try to list the questions in chronological order, including the commentaries. And in some cases, or in most cases, actually, the questions are general and not allocated to a specific speaker.
Anani, we lost you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, so the comments are general and not specifically allocated to a speaker. I would like to maybe recite the first commentary is from Jimson. So Mr. Jimson.
I think the French channel, please, I think we need to hear the English. I think there is a mix-up. The coordinator, can you please fix this mix-up because we are hearing the French interpretation in the live feed. Go ahead, Tana.
So I'm just going to give them 1 second to allocate the interpretation to the relevant channel. Thank you. So the first comment, it's from Mr. I'm just going to display again my Word document. So Mr. Jimson thinks that the borderless of the internet implies that any server can be probed from anywhere around the world. If it is unguarded or insecure, it then can be easily accessed and exploited. If there is borders, especially when it comes to prosecution of cross-border cyber crimes, then national laws can apply. I think any of the panelists can probably address this specific notion where people in general think that if there is borders, it's easier to apply national laws to cyber crime. And I think
the rule here, if you want to intervene, you can raise your question, like physically raise your question, your hand, sorry, and then you can answer the question. So instead of, if we don't have somebody assigned on the questions, the panelists can raise their hand and then answer the questions if they wish.
So anybody wishes to take this this kind of comment / question from our panelists? I'm just going to quickly look at.
Okay, may I quickly address that, please?
Please, yeah, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, basically, I think Dr. Jimson is correct. But the key thing is that nation states are limited by jurisdiction. Whether a server is guarded or unsecured, unguarded or unsecured, and it's not within their jurisdiction, one, they really don't have the right or authority to interrogate it. And more importantly, the nation state in which that infrastructure is located that has jurisdiction would certainly take exception. And that is actually what leads to international misunderstandings. So really, it gets very complicated. For example, I recollect several years ago, there was a group of con artists based in Holland who were duping Canadian farmers. They routed their illegally gotten gains through, I think, Bermuda or one of these countries, and ended up spending much of the money in Paris. But because these young men, this gang was actually African, the name of their crime was, Nigerian 419 scam. And ironically, they happened to be Ghanaian. So the jurisdictional claims can become quite complicated because the gang was based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. The victims were based in Canada. The proceeds were laundered through Bermuda or the Bahamas or somewhere like that. And the proceeds or the spending of those illicit gains was done in Paris. And of course, Africa was nowhere in the loop. But the point is that if you call it a Nigerian 419 scam, even though they were Ghanaians, the challenge you have is that the Nigerian authorities have no jurisdiction whatsoever to even investigate or interfere in such a case. And so the question then would arise, and I would defer to my colleagues like Dr. Nenna, who would have primary jurisdiction? Is it where the criminals are located? Is it where the victims are? Is it where the money was transacted? Or is it where the money was actually spent? So it does get complicated, but I think the key notion that of Dr. Jimson is correct, that at the end of the day, in order for you to deal with these kind of crimes, you need international cross-border, not just cooperation, but collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Hakim. So the following question.
I see, before you ask the second question, I see Vlada is raising his hand.
Right.
Very brief comment on what Abdul Hakim mentioned on this case. Within the norms and the confidentiality measures, norms basically, and discussion on a global level on applicability of international law, there is a dialogue on due diligence by the states. So whether the states should be obliged in a way to prevent attacks coming from their territory and assisting in case the serious attacks are coming from their territory. So that might be an interesting catch on further discussion on African continent as well, to sort of agree how the countries, and there is a norm about that actually, how the countries react when an attack comes from their territory.
Okay, thank you very much, Vlada. There is a very lively conversation in the chat window, so I can see that the panelists are already addressing some of the questions. We will try to go through the ones that are not addressed. So I think we have one that was early listed by Marilia, and I think Dr. Allison already elaborated on that. I'm not sure if the panelists have any more maybe input on the question on the World Trade Organization and the African Free Trade Agreement contribution by Marilia.
And perhaps I could just elaborate a little bit on that. I see that Marcel did respond. I think these issues that really require international cooperation in order to deal with the cross-jurisdictional issues, really, they are complex, they are intersecting. And I think, Marcel makes a very good point about the discussions, for example, within the WTO on e-commerce, the moratorium on the e-commerce negotiations, the differing position of different countries in Africa on that, and the complete lack of participation by many African countries on these issues, and how this impacts on the potential of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is now committed to looking at e-commerce in the next round of negotiations. It was previously not on the agenda. So obviously these global developments have enormous impact on each other. And I was just emphasizing Abdul's point about the need for global cooperation to deal with cross-jurisdictional issues, whether they're security issues or in fact whether they are content issues, fake news issues, Cambridge Analytica disruption, abuse of data governance for disruption of elections. These can really only be dealt with by the information regulator in the UK actually taking a position against Facebook, because that's where the data was released, and finding them appropriately. So yes, absolutely. I think I just urge us to engage far more actively in these international negotiations, and not because they always necessarily suit us or what's being proposed, but at the moment essentially we're not only just recipients of the outcomes of those which often don't represent our interests, but we also need to be far more participatory in actually setting the agendas. So at the moment, we might collaborate on certain aspects, but what we need to do even more, and obviously through the efforts of the African Union and UNEC and groups like this, is actually begin to set the agendas on these things. Because as I said, these issues of data governance, these are new issues for all countries. There's no reason why Africans shouldn't be representing those interests very early on and actually setting the agendas on these things.
Thank you, Dr. Allison. And the next contribution is actually a question from Mr. Peter King, and his question is related to the Malabo Convention. I think his question also fits into Mr. Hassan Abakar Adoum, and I'm going to combine both of them, and I think it's for Mr. Mokhtar Yadali to address these questions on the efforts that the African Union is deploying to promote the Malabo Convention, and also to ensure that more countries are actually signing this very important instrument. So, Mr. Yadali, would you like to share the strategy of the African Union on the Malabo Convention?
Well, I believe for the last 3 years, actually 4 years, since the signing of the Malabo Convention in Malabo in 2014. There is nothing that the African Union Commission has not done to have these 15 ratifications. And that starts by every year in the margin of the summit of the head of state, there is advocacy activity that are undertaken to promote the convention and request the leadership to take into consideration the Malabo Convention and sign it. And our legal counsel is opening every year a session for signing documents, and we have more signing than ratifications. Now, one has to understand that there is 2 steps. One is the signing, which is most of the member states have done. We have more than 25 signatures probably. However, the ratification is an internal national process that varies from country to country. And sometimes within the country, there is no priority for really putting that forward to the organs that are in charge of the ratification process. In some countries, it has to go through the parliament. In some countries, it has to be led by the Minister of Foreign Affairs rather than the Minister in charge of ICT. So every country depends and has its own process. We have been promoting this at every single ministerial conference, every single workshop, every single situation we use, like this one and other webinars. But unfortunately, there is something that's happening at the national level that need somebody within the country to take the leadership, the department in charge of that, and push it through the parliament or through the ratification channels within the country in order to do that. But again, we will continue with the help of everybody. We will not give up on this, but we will continue again. The good thing is no one ever has said anything or put any reservation on the ratification itself, the contents, the usefulness, the principles that are there. So that is the good thing. The bad news is nobody is taking care of, the process itself. So, but we'll continue to push. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yadali. There is many more questions on the Malabo Convention, but may I shift a little bit?
Go ahead, shoot. And please give me just Mokhtar, not Mr. Yadali, please.
Okay, Mokhtar. Okay.
Yes, I love that.
Right. I'm trying to take the questions in chronological order, but yes, it makes sense to link to, the Malabo Convention. The next question is the effort to work basically with the RECs and what kind of collaboration and coordination happening at the moment between AUC and the RECs.
All right, that's a very good question. I heard this question somewhere else. Now, again, and the regional economic communities, the 8 of them that are recognized by the African Union organs, are considered as the building blocks of the integration of the African continent. Principle number 1. Principle number 2, they are cited, they are considered as part of the whole AU process in terms of adoptions of texts and implementation of policy and decisions. Every year, there is a meeting at the high level between the leadership of the RECs and the African Union, every year. At my level, which is in not the level of the commissioners, for instance, we have included the RECs in every single project we are taking care of. Every time there is a project that requires implementation at the national and regional level, the RECs are sitting in the steering committee of that project. So there is a very good cooperation at the technical level and the higher level, where probably there is missing link in the middle management, at the level of commissioners and so on. And then we are working on that. But remember that the RECs are autonomous. They are not really, how can I say, They don't have a boss like the African Union chairperson is not their boss. They have their chairs also, they have their processes, they have their member state, they have their rules. But we tend to use all the agreement that have been signed between us as an African Union Commission and the REX, and every one of them has signed a very good memorandum of understanding about how to work together and how to implement things. And we hope that we'll be continuing to learn from the processes and increase and enhance our cooperation in order to implement projects and decisions and policy at the regional level, using the bottom-down approach and bottom-up approach and top-down approaches. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mokhtar. And we do have a number of very good suggestions on the chat window about how to promote the Malabo Convention at the local level and beyond the official and ministerial meetings. So I think I have Consular here who's suggesting to allocate focal points in each country where work is needed, and I think that's a very good suggestion to take into account.
Can I respond to that?
Of course you can.
Can I respond? Well, there was a suggestion from some RECs to have the African Union chairperson writing directly to their chairs, but also remember that the PRIDA has national focal points in each and every country. We have now, out of the 55 members of the AU, I believe we do have something that approaches the 50s. So we have a good number of focal points, and that's a good suggestion. And I'm inviting the PRIDA project manager, that are some of them are now here and participating and listening, to really use that opportunity also to help us to promote the Malabo Convention using those focal points that already designed, designated in the framework of PRIDA. But if there is a need for a specific focal point on cybersecurity, we'll be glad to do that. We are open.
Thank you very much. Okay, now that you are mentioning PRIDA program, we do have actually 2 questions, and I think we do have, as you said, the team present in this session, and they can address the question on what is the role of PRIDA in developing the local capacity of CERTs in Africa. And I think I'll just merge it with Abdul Ali question on how PRIDA project could assist the OSC to accelerate ICT transformation capacity building in Africa. Adil?
No, let me address that too.
Okay.
At its inception, the design of the PRIDA did not really address the matter of cybersecurity. And that's not because of our willingness to do so, it's because of the funding part from our partners, which it's no secret that the PRIDA is 100% funded by the European Union, and within the European Union, the departments who are dealing with the PRIDA have never dealt with the cybersecurity issue. So that's why the PRIDA at its inception did not address the matter of cybersecurity. However, that doesn't mean that the African Union doesn't have programs related to the cybersecurity and CERT. As we speak, for instance, we are currently designing a program on how to help each and every country to have their CERT. We are in the assessment phase, and we believe we are in the assessment phase, and we believe before the end of the year we'll be able to mobilize resources to help our member state to build a certain set. Remember, we have 3 objectives. 1 is cyber strategy, 2 is cyber legislation, 3 and CERT. And this is the 3 pillars of the African Union program on cybersecurity and personal data protection. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'll just like to remind everyone to keep their eyes on the chat. There's a very interesting discussion happening between Marilia Marcel and Dr. Allison on the societal approach that is very important to be applicable to cybersecurity strategies. I'm going to take a question from Mr. Zing Li. He asked a question earlier about the institutional arrangements for trans-border data flows to support global cooperation against COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know who of our panelists. I think Mr. Abdul Hakim is raising his hand. Maybe you want to take this question, Dr. Abdul?
Actually, I don't want to take that particular question because I don't have a good answer, but it is a very, very important question, so forgive me. Really, the area I wanted to just touch on was something that, hello?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Am I? Okay, okay, good. The area I wanted to touch on is an area that I think is a bit uncomfortable for us and probably is something the African Union itself would not want to really directly speak about, and that is why are African nations hesitating in adopting and ratifying? And I think that Mukhtar has actually outlined some very cogent reasons, and they're valid. However, I think the uncomfortable reasons also include issues such as the Malabo Convention in some ways would put some restraints. Now, for many of us, we would say positive restraints on African governments, but of course, governments don't see those restraints as being positive. I'll give you a couple of examples. As we speak in Nigeria, we are debating, or rather the National Assembly is debating legislation to be imposed on social media. And so some of those potential legislations might be at variance with the privacy provisions of the Malabo Convention. And so this is one of the key reasons why some African countries are a bit hesitant. Now, of course, you still need to continue the awareness so that they see a bigger picture and they understand that some of these limitations that you do want to put on social media actually will impact negatively on the development of the digital economy. So, it's part of the onus is on us to educate them. And don't forget, 1 or 2 African countries have also, unfortunately, imposed internet shutdowns. And I think it's very important that we realize that, again, some of these notions and ideas may not be well aligned with the aspirations and intent of the Malabo Convention. So while as great as the Malabo Convention is, as necessary and as important as it is, I think it's also important to understand what there might be some underlying hesitation. One, because of the impact of social media, many governments in Africa blame social media for, allowing young people to coordinate and embark on demonstrations. Meanwhile, maybe the African leaders themselves are not solving the real underlying problems that make people or drive people to go and demonstrate. So we have to keep this in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul. Just to remind everyone, we do have 4 minutes left on this session, and we have 5 questions, open questions. I see that Dr. Nena would like to add something, so maybe you have 30 seconds, and we need to wrap up the session as well. Please go ahead.
Okay, and at the same time, I'll touch on the question on GDPR. Thank you, Mr. Abdul Hakim. I'll just follow on that point. I understand that these are more of political concerns, but then we must not excuse behavior that is not responsible by states. And it takes me to discussing the GDPR. Now, the GDPR in Europe, which someone has raised, Omeri, I think, actually affects maybe individual states' consents or behaviors, but at the same time, it is being implemented. So I think it goes back to states understanding what is responsible, and I think the Malabo Convention is trying to achieve that. So there are other legislations in other parts of the world which are being implemented and states ratify those. So we can't excuse and say, oh, we should understand why states do the things they do. But then it goes back to the nature of statehood, the nature of, style of governance in Africa. I'll stop there because I have 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I think Mr. Zingzi Lee still didn't have his question answered. It's about the institutional arrangements for.
Can I touch on that, Hanani? Sorry. We have never needed cooperation, trans-border data flow as much as we need it now to curb the pandemic, addressing it from health perspectives. And yes, institutional frameworks will work very well in ensuring trans-border data flow, particularly from parts of Africa, which at times we feel that the pandemic rate is underreported. So yes, if there is that institutional framework, it will allow for a global cooperation to curb, because I believe that there is no better time than this. And it goes back to what everyone has touched on, particularly Abdul Hakim touched upon it from an international perspective. So we must look at that collaboration, if I can take the word he used, and push further for a trans-border, regulated, unified trans-border flow of data.
Anan, may I come in here, please? I think we are almost out of time. And I think there were a couple of questions that were very pertinent and important. Number one question, I think I just go quickly on to answer these two questions. One question pertaining to having cybersecurity as subsector of the economy, aiming for that. The second question pertains to, if I just get my thought clear. Yeah, what models do the African is considering in terms of the digital governance? Are we considering the US model or the China models? We are not considering either. We are trying to do our own model. So I'm going to assume that Nene and Abdul Hakim already spoken. I will give 30 minutes to the rest of the panelists, Mokhtar, Alison, and Vlada. 30 minutes, please, to wrap up to give your final closing comments. Thank you very much.
You mean 30 seconds, not 30 minutes?
Sorry,
right?
30 seconds.
Because in 30 minutes, I can stay here and talk whatever,
We have an extra 5 minutes.
Finishing your 30 seconds, Mokhtar. You have to take that.
No, I just, the issue of trust is extremely important for us as an Africans to really address our development issues. We cannot allow ourselves to miss the opportunity of really using ICT.
Développement, il faut qu'on utilise.
Alors là, vous interférez avec moi, monsieur l'interprète, s'il vous plaît.
Il faut me mettre comme interprète, en fait. C'est la 6e fois qu'on.
Mettez-le comme interprète, comme ça, moi, je reste comme speaker.
C'est pas. Ok, c'est pas à moi de le faire, en fait.
Adil, could you assign him as an interpreter so I can speak?
Can you stop interpretation for now? Because this is just the final comments from the panelists.
Okay, I was saying just quickly that Africa cannot allow itself to miss the opportunity of digital revolution in order to address its development in a different way. We have been conceiving our education's approach for the last 50 years, and we still haven't met the minimum requirement. And so we have in the health sector and etc. The ICTs are giving us the opportunity in order to really change that, leapfrog in every sector we wanted. And hence we need for that a very stable, trusted digital space. And hence the issue of trust in cybersecurity and in the cyberspace is extremely vital and important. I said at the beginning, it is digital transformation is really a survival opportunity for us as an Africans. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mokhtar. Alison?
Absolutely, Mokhtar, and absolutely critical to post-COVID economic reconstruction. We don't put this in place. We actually have an opportunity now to clear the slate, get things in place and start again. I wanted to quickly just build on what Nena and Abdul had said about the data flows and the lack of responsiveness to the Malabo Convention. I just wanted to emphasize that COVID-19 has really just highlighted things that we needed to have in place anyway. So the importance about COVID for the cross-border flows of data for COVID purposes is just highlights the need for us to have it for commerce, for research, for public health. So these are just things that really emphasize our need to have that. And of course, making that possible means having regimes that are harmonized and having regimes that can offer reciprocal protections in those environments. Safety and security protections, data protections, and then of course rights frameworks, which really goes to the question that was going on in the discussion and that Abdul was responding to in relation to the Malabo Conventions or the lack of accession to it. And it's precisely these commitments to privacy and freedom of expression by governments that will build trust. At the moment, we're just getting commitments to security and to the technical side. It's actually the commitment to privacy, to freedom of expression by governments that will build the trust for the digital economy and society. It will prevent the known harms that we know accompany it without anonymized information, without data protections and privacy protections. And it will prevent the illegitimate public and private surveillance of data that's what you need to build trust in these environments. And of course, the cybersecurity systems, the data governance systems, data protection systems provide us with the necessary mechanisms to mitigate some of these risks that we know are there. Unless we put these in place, we're simply not going to get the benefits of the digital transformation that the African Union's been pushing for.
Many thanks, Alison. Vlada?
Thanks. Well, firstly, to ask for 2 more hours for this discussion. I like it. Two quick points. One is African position, African system that has been mentioned a couple of times. I think it's not particularly a priority to have an African position necessarily on something. Certainly, Malabo Convention is one of the good examples why we should have that. But I think it's more of a priority to have states more informed and involved in a dialogue through African Union, rather than necessarily going for a position, because I mean, European Union doesn't have common position on many things, yet it's raising the states who can actually be able to get more involved in the international dialogue, synchronize their own work and positions within the Union, and that's the way to step up. And the second comment is actually related to what Nena, I think it's the key, is the enforcement. We can have as many papers and documents as we want, but if it stays the dead piece of paper, it doesn't make any sense. I come from Balkans, I know how it works. We just tick the box. We have many policies, it doesn't get implemented. There's so many things that we can do on a lower level while developing the framework and the policies. And one of those I mentioned is securing the devices and the whole environment. There are many things we should be talking about how Africa can boost trust beyond just coming to the documents, which is necessary. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Vlada. I think there's some concern by the people who ask questions that the question, I think we can answer the question after the session. Thank you very much for participating and actively contributing to this very rich discussion. We apologize for the timing. I think we have very short time, but hope we are glad that we managed to address some of the key issues that being presented here. And I want to thank you very much for your participation and have a nice evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.